In the last video, I explained where cancer comes from, what it is, and what it's caused by. It's caused by mutagens, and I explained also that the biggest mutagen was ionising radiation. And I led up to the proposal that's shown by recent research that the deaths from cancer deaths from the radiation exposure to children born around about 1959 to 1963, when there was the nuclear weapon testing, atmospheric testing, which contaminated the environment. This is the biggest contamination of the environment in the whole of evolution, had resulted in about 500 million cancer deaths. You can show this quite clearly. And also I said, well, what can we do about it? And I said that we were going to try to do something about it, and we hope for some help in this. The evidence that this was happening, that the radiation model that underpins the legal limits, which are laid down by governments in the West, that model was wrong. It was dishonestly constructed and it was false. And we knew this shortly after Chernobyl. So in 1998 I helped to start the European Committee on Radiation Risk with some eminent, clever scientists, Alice Stewart, Rosalie Bertel, Alexei Yablokov, and we ended up figuring out a new risk model which we published in 2003. This is the risk model that we published in 2003. And it was translated into all sorts of languages, into Japanese, into Spanish, into French, into Russian. And it provided evidence at the time, all the evidence we had, that the risk model was wrong, that the risk model of the time was wrong. And then in 2007, a new risk model was published by the International Commission on Radiological Protection, and that's this one here. That's the 2007 risk model. Essentially it's the same risk model that existed right the way back to the beginning of the study of radiation and health. That was in about 1952. It hadn't really changed since 1952, this one. And this is the one that still underpins the radiation limits published by governments, even now in 2026. By 2010, various pieces of evidence had emerged from populations who had been exposed to Chernobyl radiation that the risk model was wrong, and this was collected into a new report, the ECRR 2010, and by that time we knew a lot more about how radiation worked. There had been a lot more research that showed radiation affected the genetic system, the one I was describing in the last video. But since 2010 there's been an enormous amount of new evidence that's appeared, and the most important of this, the most important pieces of evidence are collected together in the new ECRR report, which should be published this year. But various bad things for us, if you like, or for the population of the world, have happened since President Trump came recently to say that we needed to have investment and development of small nuclear reactors and nuclear in general. So what President Trump did in executive order something or another last year, May of last year, was to try to relax the radiation limits that were encapsulated in American law. So this would result, if it comes about, and he has in fact made pretty certain that he wants it to come about, this will ensure a resurgence of the nuclear industry and enormous amounts of contamination to the populations of America. And in the United Kingdom, similar sort of nonsense, what the British government is doing under Sir Keir Starmer, is to try and make Britain a hothouse for developing small nuclear reactors and generally moving towards nuclear. Well, this may be all very well, because certainly in order to run the system as it is at the moment, the system that creates huge amounts of material and sells things to each other and generally kind of uses the global environment as a kind of rubbish tip, putting the results of all of this stuff into. And of course the population of the West has increasing cancer rates, as I pointed out in the last video. So the question is, what can we do about it? Because we have to really stop this from happening. And so what I tried to do is I tried to encourage some people in America to set up a United States version of the European Committee of Radiation Risk. That would be and that's now happened. It's called the International Committee on Radiation Risk, the ICRR, and it has its own website. And its first document encapsulates all of the evidence that has appeared in the scientific peer review literature. So we're not talking about arm waving stuff, and we're not talking about somebody thinks this and somebody thinks that. We're talking about stuff that can go into a court and win a case. This is real evidence, scientific evidence, and it's mostly epidemiological. So what I want to do here is to present it, and then I will make a point about the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution of the United States with regard to all of this stuff. So first of all, the document that we have created, which contains all of the, well, it doesn't contain all of the evidence, it contains enough of this evidence to show that the current risk model is completely crazy, and that is out by a factor of at least 1,000 times. What that means is that if you get what they call a dose of something or another, like 1 millisievert, that at the moment that's the legal limit. 1 millisievert, 100 millirem, that's the annual limit for your dose. That's being relaxed, incidentally, if Trump's executive order is carried out. So if you get 1 millisievert, which under this ICRP model, this one, 1 millisievert would not cause any measurable effect in cancer. So if you had a population all exposed to 1 millisievert, you wouldn't expect to see anything at all, and that's what they maintain. So when they do see something, when it is discovered, for example, at Sellafield in the United Kingdom, that there was a 10-fold excess risk of childhood leukemia, there was even a court case, which I was marginally involved in, and the court case was lost on the basis that the dose that these children would have got, which was about half a millisievert, couldn't possibly have caused the 10-fold excess in childhood leukemia. But putting that all to one side, what this document here, this is the cover, very, very powerful cover, with a picture of a woman who obviously has cancer lying in bed and being treated for it. And this is the essential problem, is the excess cancer, the increased cancer rates. This is an 8-page account of the evidence, and I'm going to now go through each one of these pieces of evidence shortly, just to present it. Now, all of these pieces of evidence have citations to the full study, which is published in the scientific literature. But I have to say that none of these studies have been considered at all by the risk agencies. They've been just dismissed, pushed to one side, it's impossible, we're not going to bother with them, and so on. Okay? And this is strictly illegal under European law. And as I will point out, it's illegal under the United States Fifth Amendment of the Constitution. But let's start with the studies. The first one is that there was a significant increase in infant leukemia. That's leukemia in babies aged 0 to 1 year. That jumped up in a lot of different countries in Europe, in 5 different research groups from different universities, all detected this increase in different countries. The countries were Scotland, Wales, Greece, Germany and Belarus. Now, there can be no other cause for a sudden increase in infant leukemia in those children who were exposed to Chernobyl radiation in that year. So you have infants, you have children in the womb who are exposed to the Chernobyl radiation, and then the next year they get leukemia. And this is highly statistically significant. It could not have occurred by chance. And this was published in the peer-reviewed literature. And in fact, this finding led to the UK Environment Minister Michael Meacher, who I knew as a result of telling him about this infant leukemia issue. He set up a committee to examine it, but in the end the committee, when it started to show that there was an effect, it was shut down and he was sacked by the government under Tony Blair. So the second piece of evidence is that data that was made available by the Childhood Cancer Research Organisation, ECRG, Childhood Cancer Research Group in Oxford. These are people who continued the work of Alice Stewart. Alice Stewart was the first chair of the ECRR. She was the first person to show that childhood X-rays, obstetric X-rays of the mother, resulted in an increase in leukemia in the children who were born to the mothers who were X-rayed. That was the first piece of evidence of the exquisite power of ionising radiation to cause genetic damage. Anyway, she lost her job. She was kicked out of Oxford, had to go to Birmingham. She was an interesting person. Anyway, I knew her reasonably well. And she was, as I say, the first president of the ECRR, but then she died. And in fact, most of the people who were with me on the European Committee on Radiation Risk are dead. They were older than me, not much older than me, but the only one that's left now, in fact, no, younger than me, Rosalie Bertel was 78, I think, when she died. But so really, pretty much the only person left is, together with me in the ECRR, as a structural group to decide on what to do, is Inga Schmitz-Feuerhaker. And she, Professor Schmitz-Feuerhaker, also a good friend of mine, she is 92, I think, now. Anyway, so just the two of us. So data made available by this committee showed a sharp increase in childhood leukemia aged 0 to 4 in Wales and Scotland combined. So this data was for the United Kingdom, and it separated it into Wales and Scotland. And when you look at it, there's a very sharp increase in childhood leukemia. Now that shows that the risk model is in error, because we measured the radiation in the people after Chernobyl in England, that the risk model is in error by a factor of 500 times. The infant leukemias show that the risk model is wrong by 1,000 times. See, these are big numbers. Then there's another one. Inga Schmitz-Feuerhaker and I looked at congenital malformations or birth defects in Europe after Chernobyl. This is also was published in a good toxicology journal, and the references here. It showed that the doubling dose for childhood mutagenic effects for birth defects was 10 millisieverts. So, and in fact, we were getting increases in congenital malformations in children throughout Europe over like 20 or 30 different studies, showing that just the small amount of, like a few millisieverts of radiation from Chernobyl caused an increase in birth defects in lots of different countries, and the error there is about 500 times. So fourthly, and this is one of the most important ones, is that the basis for the current risk model, this risk model of the ICRP, this one, the basis of this is the study of the survivors of the Hiroshima bomb. This is called the lifespan study, and that study was carried out and is still being carried out. And what that shows is that if you take it as a linear effect, if you take it as like double the dose, double the cancer, treble the dose, treble the cancer, that's a linear effect. So in other words, 0 dose, no cancer, 100 times 100 dose, 100 times cancer. That's called the linear no threshold risk model, which is quite wrong, incidentally. But the coefficients that came out of the lifespan study, which is still ongoing, they show that in order to get a 50% chance of cancer, you have to get a dose of 1,000 millisieverts. Now that's an enormous dose. Nobody gets that unless you're sitting outside Chernobyl or Fukushima when it explodes. So nobody normally in the population would get anything like that sort of dose. But of course that dose is meaningless when it's applied to internal radiation, which is one thing that's emerged. And secondly, and more important, it's emerged that the study of the Hiroshima survivors was dishonestly manipulated. That in 1973, the risk epidemiologists who were studying the increases in cancer after the atomic bomb, so 1973 back to 1953, or 30 years later, is that right? No, 20 years later. In 1973, they threw out the control group. So in other words, they had three groups. They had like a high dose group, a medium dose group, and a zero dose group. I think a low dose group and a zero dose group. And all of the effects of radiation should have been assessed by comparing the higher dose groups with the zero dose group. But astonishingly, they found that the zero dose group had too much cancer, so that the zero dose group and the second higher dose group and the second higher and the third higher dose group, they all had the same level of cancer, and then the high dose group had a little bit more. And so they threw out the zero dose group. And you can't do that in an epidemiological study. It's dishonest. So what that showed is that there was a question over all of the results that came out of the lifespan study, and that raises the same question over all of the dose coefficients for cancer which were published and which the legal limits that exist are now based on. And now the other thing is that it was discovered, and I pretty much discovered this as a result of my work with the nuclear test veterans when lots of evidence came out from in the court case in 2016 that where I was involved in as a representative for two of the nuclear test veterans. And we had an eminent Japanese physicist who came to tell us what he had discovered. And there were two basic discoveries. One was that he found that people who had not been anywhere near or not close enough to the bomb to get any dose at all were suffering high levels of cancer. And another study that was done by a man called Wanatabe and his co-workers in 2007, I think, or 2008, they brought in a new control group. So they realized that the zero dose group had been dishonestly thrown out, and so they decided to make their own zero dose group control, which was in a separate prefecture. So in other words, it wasn't in Hiroshima at all, it's next door prefecture. And what they found was that there was a much higher level of cancer than had been assessed by the lifespan study. So those three things showed that the risk model, the basis of the risk model, the lifespan study of the risk model, was dishonestly manipulated. Right. So those are good bits of information. Those are important bits of information that show that the risk model is false. Now, the Kerry Committee was set up by Michael Meacher, the Environment Minister in England, to look into the effects of Chernobyl. And the Childhood Cancer Research Group gave us data to enable us to look at the effects of Chernobyl on leukemia in children. And so when this was believed to be, and is still believed to be, the best information on childhood leukemia. So we had the numbers of cases by year right the way back to 1960, because we were also looking at the effects of the weapons fallout on childhood leukemia. And when you plot that data, what you find is that there was a huge increase in childhood leukemia aged 0 to 4. in Wales and Scotland, over the period of time that the children were contaminated with the material from Chernobyl. And the graph showing this, and also showing the whole body monitoring, is to be found in this document, and the citation is there also. Then there's the evidence from the observation of childhood leukemia risks near nuclear sites and radioactively contaminated coasts. This is all well known. This was in the earlier data. Then there's new evidence from the study of nuclear workers. If you look at nuclear workers, you find that instead of having a linear no-threshold response, so in other words, double the dose and double, you have two responses. You have a very, very high level of cancer at a very, very low dose, and after that it drops down and goes up later on. And this is explainable by mechanistic reasoning, which involves the existence of two different populations of cells. And we know that there are two different populations of cells in the body at any time. They're the ones that are already replicating, which are extremely sensitive, and the ones that are not, that are just sitting back at watching the television and sort of like hanging about. And they're not sensitive. And the reason that the ones that are replicating are sensitive is because at the point that they're replicating, the DNA is actually involved in changing itself and splitting into two DNAs. And at that point, if it's hit by radiation, it's 100 times more sensitive to introducing a genetic mutation. So that's also been published. And then we have looked, there's another very important one, where if you look at official United States Navy cancer data, you find that sailors who are on nuclear-powered ships have a 10-fold excess risk of cancer. Of course, a nuclear-powered ship is like a nuclear power station, except that all of the radiation goes into the ship, because the ship is basically a tin can with people inside it, and all the radiation goes into the tin can, so it builds up. And in submarines, it builds up very badly. And I've done a court case, I'm doing a court case about a nuclear submariner in England who died of cancer as a result of exposure to radionuclides, which were measured in the crew. So we have measurements of cobalt-60, gamma emitter, by whole body monitoring of the crew. So now, the next one is that there have been two studies, one of them is mine and one of them is Joe Mangano's, which have compared populations exposed to the nuclear test fallout, the atmospheric testing fallout, in different parts of the United States. The United States is a very big place, and it has a lot of dry areas to the west and a lot of wet areas to the east. And so when the nuclear fallout came from the atomic weapons testing, it differentiated between these two areas. So very little fallout came down in Arizona, New Mexico and California, and lots of strontium-90 came down in Kentucky, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, those places where there's a lot more rain. And when you study this, you find that the people who are most at risk of cancer are those people, who are living, who were born, not living, but who were born in the high fallout period 1959 to 1963. Those people who live in the southeast, where there was a lot of strontium-90, and we've measured the strontium-90 there. It was measured in milk, and that's all known. So exposure to the nuclear fallout defines a population at 50% excess risk. Now what this means essentially, if you reduce it to one sentence, is that as a result of if we look at the increase in cancer since say 1980, when this cancer epidemic began, and we look at all those people, we find that if you develop cancer around about 2015 to 2020, the probability that your cancer was caused by your exposure to radiation when you were born is 50%. So in other words, 1 in 3 cancers, to put it crudely, 1 in 3 cancers in that population who were born 1959 to 63 is caused by genetic damage that was induced when they were babies. Strontium-90 plutonium-239, whole loads of isotopes that bind to DNA, for example, barium-140, and mainly uranium. And we find uranium effects on cancer wherever we look. So that's the final piece of evidence, except for one more piece of evidence, which came out very, very recently, in fact, after we started this project, was that 3 researchers working at Harvard decided to do what nobody had done before, and look at the cancer risk by proximity to nuclear power stations in the United States. And what they found was a statistically significant link between high levels of cancer and proximity to all the nuclear power stations in the United States. This is a Harvard group, and how they got it published is beyond me, because I can tell you it's extremely difficult to get this stuff published, because the reviewers all work for the nuclear industry or they're biased. So basically that's it. I want to present this to you. You can get it, and I'll put the website where this publication can be found. And what I'd like you all to do is to use it. I'd like you to use it and get in touch with anybody that you think might be capable of changing the mind of the government and altering the risk model in the direction of reality. That's what I would like you to do. That's what we all must do. But I should leave you with just one thing. And this is something that I discussed with Stuart Smith, who was a lawyer that I worked with for a long time. He and I were thinking about, he was thinking about taking a case to the Supreme Court on the back of the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution of the United States, which I printed out here, so I'll just read the important bit. The Fifth Amendment, 1791. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury. In other words, you've got to go before a jury, except in certain cases which they go on about. Nor shall any person be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself. That's the one everybody says, I plead the Fifth Amendment. But then it says, nor to be deprived of life, liberty or property without due process of law. Well, Stuart was of the opinion, and I am of the opinion, that that means that people are being killed by a risk model which has never really been through a due process of law. It has been a sort of diktat right the way back to when they needed to make these nuclear weapons so that they could drop them on Russians. So that's it, basically. Of course, poor Stuart Smith never got to do anything because he was killed or he suddenly died. And then, of course, I was kicked out of all of those court cases, but that's by the way. That's by the way. So nobody has taken this Fifth Amendment case for the risk model. So thank you for listening, and I'll leave you to download this document and to use it and send it around and make it an enormous explosion so it rises on the horizon of the risk model and people with the brightness of 1,000 suns.